Does it work? Yeah? Okay, good. Well, thanks for having me over today. Yeah, I worked here at Cherokee for 10 years as a psychologist, but I was in the school psych department, which is now a lot smaller than when I was here. At the time I was here, we had about 15 school psychologists and had worked in various school systems around providing school psych services. The class center, just before I get going on this, so Corn is the family name that they gave a donation to the university to start this center, and I was the first person hired to start it. It's been an adventure, as anyone who starts certain projects can attest to. So a couple other things that we do the things that Dr. Rogers talked about. We also are a training facility, so we provide training for third and fourth year doctoral school psychology students who are going to become school psychologists and or psychologists later on. And so we partner with the school psych program over at UT, and so we're able to pull on the research that they do. Very good researchers in the field, nationally recognized in terms of what they do as far as, especially with classroom behavior stuff and intellectual assessment. There's Steve McCollum is a test author who produces an intelligence test. So anyway, we do a lot of things over there. But what I'm going to talk about today is learning disabilities, learning disorders. I didn't, and I told them, I don't have that many slides because usually there's discussion that sort of branches off, and I wanted to allow for that versus me just standing here and talking to you for the entire time. It's learning disabilities, learning disorders. It's a bit of a frustrating area for a lot of folks, especially in the schools these days. And so we'll kind of talk about the process. I didn't include specific numbers because they vary so much from system to system, but we'll talk about it as we go. So, wrong one again. All right, so let's just start with the definitions, which is usually a good place to start. But IDEA, most of you know, that's special ed, basically, in the schools. But specific learning disability, they talk about a disorder and the basic psychological processes in those areas, using language, spoken or written, can be, deals with listening, thinking, speaking, reading, writing, spelling, and do math calculations. So that's sort of the broad brush of a learning disability in terms of special ed or IDEA. It does also, which is interesting to me, it includes some of these terms. So perceptual disabilities, brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, developmental aphasia. Only one there that really comes up typically in learning disorder, learning disability discussion. The others, brain injury is usually better accounted for in traumatic brain injury. It's another category for special education. Perceptual disabilities are they're kind of all over the place, and so not readily identified, and minimal brain dysfunction, that's kind of a touchy wording, and developmental aphasia is more language based, but so does not include these things down here for good reason. Emotional disturbance is also there's some rule outs you have to look at in terms of emotional disturbance and learning disabilities. You can have both. There's no rule against that, but it just can't be that the learning disability can't be a result of an emotional disturbance. And then the other factors or rule outs is what we talk about. So that's IDEA, special ed. I'll get this by the end. So in the clinic, this is what we have to work with. So psychologists in the room are very familiar with the DSM-5. And so it's a little more general in some ways in terms of what could be considered a learning disorder. I use the most general definition that's in there for the purpose here, and I'll talk about some specific areas shortly. But it's a developmental disorder. Everyone agrees on that. It begins by school age, but may not be recognized until later. Over at the university, we do evaluate college students, and occasionally we get some through there that have learning disorders, and it's usually reading disorders, which most of the individuals are fairly intelligent and have been able to compensate over the years and have gotten okay grades, but it breaks down once they get to the point of the amount of reading that they have to do. So it's not often, but it does come up. Interestingly, we've gotten a lot of adult referrals for dyslexia evaluations lately. I don't know, just kind of out of the blue, we've gotten several, and they're not college students, coming from outside. So I don't know if you're hearing that anywhere, but it was an interesting, we were talking about it last week, how many dyslexia evaluations that we've had specifically for adults. But anyway, reading, writing, and math. That's the for the clinical side. That's where what we deal with in terms of learning disorders. And also you'll notice that the difference in disorder versus disability, right? Disorders is something that can be diagnosed. Disability sort of implies some level of eligibility for services. So there's a little bit of a distinction there. You can have a disorder but not a disability, obviously. Okay, so areas of LD. For your school-based LD, these are the ones that are primarily dealt with. So basic reading, reading comprehension, reading fluency, those you can kind of lump those obviously into reading. Math calc and math reasoning, though it's called problem solving, are the two areas, and then written expression is the fifth area. Interesting thing about written expression, it doesn't exist anymore. It's a kind of a thing in the schools because, and I say that tongue-in-cheek because the way that LD is identified these days in the school system, there's not a good way to identify that, and so they're not being referred for that. So it's an issue, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the process. But it is definitely an issue. Another area that's not evaluated very well these days in the schools is reading comprehension. So, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Over in the clinic, you have your reading, math, and writing, and there's just the unspecifieds, which you can kind of piece together something. Written expression does now include spelling, though, with the DSM in the DSM-5. So you can have a disorder in spelling, but usually if you've got problems with spelling, there's problems with reading, and it's better accounted for in reading. But I always find that interesting that they included that as a specific LD area. It's because, again, it's usually connected. Spelling in isolation is usually not a huge issue. Okay, so now here's where we get all sort of weird about things. Identification. So how do we identify these learning disorders, learning disabilities? And there are two different paths in terms of school versus clinic. In, I guess, the majority of states now, the departments of education have moved to this response to intervention process. Anyone know what that is? I know Brooke does. Anyone know what the RTI process is? What is that? What does it mean? You deal with some schools and deal with some kids, and anyone know? I don't know. Kind of rule outs, and it's a process. It takes some time, and it's frustrating on certain levels for different reasons. But yeah, I know it is. But it's also interestingly in the schools. It's almost as frustrating in the schools as it is for people outside the schools, and I'll branch off on that too. So here's a good thing about response to intervention. All the kids are screened. All the kids coming through schools are screened in what they call benchmark evaluations. Happens at least 3 times a year, fall, winter, and spring. They are, in most of the schools in Tennessee, systems in Tennessee, they're very good with reading fluency measures, okay? Words per minute, correct words per minute. and they use that measure. There are some other reading measures, but that's the one that's kind of the better developed component for reading. There's also a math screening, digits correct per minute, so there's another process there, but most systems don't do the math screening because they're just not set up to do it. And then there's nothing in writing, so that's where it's kind of got cured. Again, tongue-in-cheek, but that's all are screened, and that's a universal screener. And so, depending on where the kids' scores fall on those measures, they have different cut score levels for the different school systems to determine whether or not the child should flow into another level of more intensive intervention services. Now, what's that cut score? So that's where it gets really interesting, because every school system has a slightly different approach to that. And so that's where, if you're working across school systems, it gets very frustrating because one school system has a certain level of a cut score where a kid would go from just general classroom instruction into an intervention, and you go over to this system, this county next door, and it's a little bit different. And so it gets confusing and frustrating. Again, on the inside too, because for the school psychologists who are receiving the kids from the other system, they've got other stuff to, you got to sort things out. So the state gave a sort of a maximum level for a child for their functioning to be able to roll into a tier of intervention, and that's a 25th percentile. That's that's the top end. So if you're scoring below the 25th percentile on the reading measure or the math measure in some systems, but in the state, that might get you into the next level of intervention, the next tier of intervention. In that level of intervention, you're supposed to be pulled out sort of pulled out for specific intervention on the areas that you have been identified as having a deficit in. So let's just stick with reading. It's supposed to be a smaller group with more intensive instruction specifically geared to what your area of deficit is. Now, in some systems it's the 25th percentile. It can go down to the 10th percentile and places in between. And so that's very frustrating, again, depending on where you are in the process. There are multiple tiers of intervention, and there are multiple weeks of intervention. So the good news is kids are getting intervention, right? Whereas in the past, they might have to wait until they fail, and they get referred for an evaluation, then maybe they get identified, and then they receive special ed services. Well, in the RTI model, kids are receiving intervention services earlier. And so it's just that it takes a long time to get through the process. So in Tennessee, there are 3 tiers of intervention. So you go through, you start at 1, 2, 3, special education. So I guess it would be technically a 4-tier if you count special education as a tier. And then as far as weeks of intervention, that can go up to 12-ish weeks per tier, depending on the system, and that varies. So you could, math on that, I think that's on another slide, you could be in intervention for 36 weeks or so before being determined to have a special need, a special ed need. So it can be a long, drawn-out process. Questions up to this point? We'll come back. Over in the clinic, it's a little cleaner, but it may or may not be helpful in the schools. It's your old, let's pull out some tests, let's evaluate the child. Over in our clinic, we do some intelligence testing. The DSM-5 criteria is a little bit more straightforward in terms of making that identification. And in the DSM, it does say that intervention model is not prohibited. So if a student comes in with intervention data or information that they have been going through the process, then that's usually helpful in making that determination. But it's a little easier over on the clinic side. Now, that doesn't mean that that transfers back into the schools, which is another frustration for parents especially. Okay, so response to intervention. Anyone seen one of these fun little graphs? So this is what schools look at. So this is and this is just a fictional. This is made up, but this is words correct per minute. Okay, so in this particular measure, this is 60 words correct per minute on up to 100 words correct per minute. These red dots on here are associated with specific measures of their reading rate each week. Once you go into a tier, that's another thing. So whereas I said in the universal screening, it's 3 times a year that they get that assessment. Once you flow over into a tier, your assessment becomes much more often. So in some cases it's weekly, in some cases it's every other week. So they're assessed ongoing as the process goes. So that's what these dots in this line represents, is that ongoing assessment. And at the bottom, is you can see it shows the number of weeks in intervention. What this blue line, it's called the AIM line in this particular case. This is basically what the average kid would be expected to progress over the course of that same amount of time. And so you're measuring your response to intervention. How well is intervention improving these scores to match up with that AIM line? Getting close to your target levels of functioning in that area. Then on this particular case, that X out there represents, it corresponds with the green line, which is IEP goal, but that's the end goal for the year, and so that's where the kids should be by the end of the year. So you'll hear things about gap analysis. Anyone heard gap analysis? That term been used anywhere? So they're trying to determine, based on where your score is now and your rate of improvement. ROI is another. It's not return on investment, but it's rate of improvement in the schools. How well you're improving. Is your line moving up toward the AIM line? Is it going to intersect and move ahead? Is it kind of just paralleling that line? Is it, flat line? Or in some cases, is it getting worse? Okay? So when schools examine the data and they have the child in let's say Tier 2 intervention, and they continue to measure their level of reading or math functioning, and they're plotting this data, and they're trying to determine, is the kid making improvement? Are they responding to the intervention? That's kind of where that fun term came from. So if that line is moving up toward the goal, then that's an indicator that they are responding to intervention, and they will either remain at the same level of intervention for a length of time, or if their scores improve to a high enough level, then they'll move them out of intervention back into general ed. Okay? If the line isn't improving or is flatlining or dropping, then over a certain amount of time, again, it could be about 12 weeks-ish, then they may be dropped into the more intensive level of intervention, go down into Tier 3 intervention, which is supposed to be even more individualized. It's a very small group. In theory, it should be almost one-on-one, but I think 3 to 1 is kind of the accepted ratio for that. 3 students per instructor. But that's the general process. Now, if the student goes to Tier 3 and they're still not making progress, it's flatlining or still kind of on a decline, and that continues over the set amount of time, then they may be found eligible for special education as having a learning disorder, learning disability. So does that kind of make sense? Sometimes it's hard to explain this to parents, and the schools have a hard time doing that because it is kind of a time-consuming process. Schools are not, if a parent brings a concern to the school about their child that they have a learning disability, the school is not legally supposed to say, we can't evaluate your child until we work through this process, but the school has to work through this process. Does that make sense? That's really convoluted. Like, the school is not allowed to say that we have to go through this process, but the state says you have to go through this process. So, it's frustrating for the school too. So I don't want to pick on the schools, but there's frustration on both sides of this process. But the old days where a parent could come in because they think their child has a learning disability and just say, I want my child evaluated for a learning disability, and they just test them in the next few weeks and make a decision, it's really not allowed by the state criteria. And so the parents can go request that, and they do, but it still takes time because it's not that, like the clinic version of just give some tests, make a determination, and make a decision as to eligibility. This is the model that the state has adopted, and it's a model that many states have adopted. So it's not just Tennessee. There are some states that still use the discrepancy model, which is the old version, and then there's some states that use this pattern of strengths and weaknesses. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but it looks at your cognitive processing areas and strengths and weaknesses, and depending on how your scores fall on that and your academic achievement, do they match up? You could also be found to have a learning disorder, learning disability in those cases as well. So, but this is the model we have. This is it. It's flawed. It is. There were attempts when this was rolled out, before it was rolled out, to explain the challenges, but many of you have worked for the Department of Education before, and so understand that sometimes they're eager to get things out and going, and then sometimes have to go back and rethink things. So anyway, questions over this?
Well, so if a child moves, right in the middle, that it's supposed to do, they just pick up here whatever they're on?
Not necessarily. Yeah, not necessarily. Well, 30, by definition, 36 weeks is 180 instructional days, and that's a school year. Yeah. Now, I mean, if you score in some systems, if you score low enough or to a low enough level earlier in the process, then you may bypass a tier and go into a more intensive tier, and so that may shorten that process. If the child is showing response to the intervention, though, there's improvement or not, it's at least headed up, the school may leave them there for a while, and that's often a complaint that we hear from parents, teachers too some, but parents more, is that they get kind of stuck in a tier, they get stuck in an intervention process, and it can be bad, but it can be good, because if you think about it, the child is getting targeted intervention. I mean, in the parent's mind, they may be thinking, I want my child to get special education services. And sometimes we have a discussion with parents, that may not be the best thing. It may be better to be in an intervention class where the instruction is very, I don't want to say better, but there are different issues sometimes in some of the special ed classes that if you're just getting your targeted intervention and reading, in this case, it might be a better fit, even though you're kind of stuck in that intervention for a longer term. So, but yeah, system to system. Now, sometimes the systems will share the information pretty well, but sometimes they just show up and they don't have the information and they don't know. Schools don't know. Yeah.
So this is a system that can see it statewide.
Yes.
Schools might have different
Yes.
How long roughly has it been
2014. Does that sound right, Brooke? July 2014, I believe, is when it officially hit the books. So, we had issues at the university. We had issues with this model. We sent letters to the Board of Education when they were implementing this. Our esteemed Steve McCollum, who I mentioned earlier, and the department head for it's over the special ed department at UT. They both went to Nashville and met with them about and tried to explain that just moving to this model alone might not be in the best interest of every child, but that was just moved on. What we had advocated at the time, which would have been about a year before, maybe July-ish of 2013, what we advocated was sort of a hybrid model, which would be, do this is fine, but not every kid fits this model and would benefit, and so have some sort of discrepancy out, like can you let's evaluate this kid, and like written expression, the one that I'm kind of joking about, that would have been a good area because there aren't any good measures for written expression in this curriculum-based measurement model. There just aren't. There's nothing out there that works for this. And so that might have been like a disorder or disability category where some hybrid of this would have been a better approach to take for those kids. So the response from the state, because I've emailed, what about the kids with written expression? And her response is that, well, they also have reading problems, and it's usually associated with that. So, let's focus on the reading stuff, and we'll deal with the writing stuff as it comes up. So that was my email response back from the State Department. So it is moved now into the high schools, which leads to a whole other level of issue because if you deal with high school kids, how many reading intervention programs to teach kids to read do you think are out there for adolescent, high school age kids? I mean, you teach kids to read that are, young, and so there just aren't that many packages or curriculum packages out there to deal with that. And so now we have some high school kids that are fairly frustrated because they're using curricular materials that aren't necessarily geared to them. But start somewhere. But yeah, it's in high schools. Nope. Not anymore. Now, there still are some who have been identified as LD previously, that if, in special ed, most of you know this, you get reevaluated at least every 3 years. That's the minimum number of reevaluations. You're not always required to retest in that reevaluation process. And so there are some kids who were identified earlier under the old model as LD, and the IEP team comes together, and the school psychologist, if they think this kid really needs these services and they don't want to go through the process, they'll recommend don't do testing again, because if you recommend testing again, then you've got to go through this model to requalify. And so if the child's been receiving services and they need services, you don't want to put them back through this model if it's unnecessary. So they'll recommend no testing, requalify, and just continue on with the current path. Because this is very frustrating for a 10th grader. That's it just is. Middle schoolers are a little frustrated too, but middle schoolers are always frustrated. If anyone, middle school population, anyone deal with the middle school population? It's an interesting group. Regardless of this stuff, that's just an interesting group to deal with because they're dealing with a lot of stuff. So, all right, any other on this? And we can always come back to this stuff. Oh, did it again. Okay, so I included this, and it's in the slides. So this is dated. It's 2005. This table, but it was a national nationally representative table. And I thought it's just interesting for folks to kind of see how many words per minute kids should be reading. And so when you look at the table, so this is, the grades, and these are percentiles. So your average kid, let's say this is, I'm going to go with the second grader, 50th percentile, and this corresponds to those benchmarks that I was talking about earlier, so fall, winter, and spring. And so in the fall, when they first start, this is usually around October-ish, depending on the school system. Like a system in Knox County, they got to start early because they got to test there's 56, 57,000 kids in the system, and now high school, they got to test just about all these kids 3 times a year in these screeners. But let's go back to the second grade. So 50 percentile. So when they start out in second grade, our average second grader is reading 51 words per minute correctly. And so by the end of the school year, they're at 89 words correct per minute. So that's only 38 words. They increase their words per minute by about 38 words per minute by the end of the year. Now, something interesting, though, which they go to third grade, right, 50th percentile. Well, they're at 71 words per minute. Well, they were at 89 words per minute in second grade. What? Well, there's some are, there's a little bit of a drop-off because it's reading's practice, and so and that happens in about every grade until you get to be a very fluent reader. So 81, so 71, and you're up to 107 by the end of third grade. So from the end of second grade to end of third grade, on average, you're about, 28, 30-ish, getting close to about 30 words per minute, correct improvement. And it kind of holds. So you go 107 to 123 to 139 to 150, and then you plateau. So about 150 words per minute is your average kid reading speed. That's words correct. That's not just, just reading them, just random words. That's connected text. But we're dealing with, in this process, in some systems, we're dealing with kids that are, below the 25th percentile, and then the next level of cut is about the 10th percentile. But there are values in between there, again, depending on the school system. But that's just, I wanted to include that just to give you an idea of how many words kids should be reading and how fast they can read. So, but that's the sort of data that they look at. Now, there's newer norms than that. There are newer national norms. They're embedded into measurement systems. Ames Web is one that's used a lot. And Knox County uses Ames Web as it has the measures, it includes the data, it allows for them to plot the data and all that sort of stuff. School systems were encouraged to develop local norms. So, because not every kid would correspond to this. So some school systems, some of the, we at the Class Center, we work with some rural school systems. And so you might have a larger group of kids out in some of the more rural systems that are below the 25th percentile than is represented on a national norm. So they are encouraged to develop their own local norms for these things. So anyway, questions? So and I talked about the time to identification. So it's about 36 weeks. It can be 36 or more weeks to do that. And then interventions are being implemented. So they are getting some interventions. It's not all bad. One thing that schools, again, on the school side, to not bash the schools, but one of the things they struggle with is the RTI model does require a certain student to teacher ratio, depending on the tiers. And schools have run into a problem with that because they weren't allocated any more funds. Because if you do the math on that, if you're going from, let's say you've got 30 in a classroom, and then you need to pull out 15 in that classroom for a teacher, and then you've got to pull out 3 or 4 for another teacher, and it's all going on at the same time during the day, where are they getting those teachers to do that other stuff? Because you can't take the teacher out of the room that's got the 30 kids to do this other stuff. So it gets to be a bit of a challenge. And so it's a resource issue as well on the school end of things. It's an unfunded mandate, as that term goes. But are they supposed to do it? They are. That's what's been decreed. And in the clinic, obviously, you can go in and you can identify it almost immediately, but the schools aren't obligated to accept that, which is the first thing I said there. So they're not. So it may be helpful information for them, and they may use that data, but they still have to go through that process. Now, the one thing, though, that clinic-based evaluations can be more helpful for is if there's some non-LD concerns as well. That may speed up the process because they're not under the same guidelines as far as identification. So if they've got ADHD or if they've got some other stuff going on, they might be able to find a way to get services faster in that case. There for a while, I think it's calmed down. It seemed like there were more referrals for attention problems out in the schools because parents and teachers figured out they get referred for this instead of this, they might get services faster. That makes sense. So ADHD referrals went up a little bit. I think it's calmed back down though. But people figure out ways around things. Always. All right. And we can come back to that too. I mean, all that stuff. But any questions over that? Because I wanted to talk a little bit about dyslexia because that seemed to be the big thing last summer because there's a bill. Does anyone know what the bill, Say Dyslexia? Is that what it was called? I think it's called Say Dyslexia. There was an advocacy group that I guess their kids had dyslexia. And the schools historically have avoided using the term dyslexia. And I don't know why. I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong with the term dyslexia. We know it sort of, the characteristics of what dyslexia is. Even in training programs, we sort of stayed away from the term because schools didn't like the term. And so there was a grassroots effort to require school systems to address dyslexia. So last summer, a bill got passed. I think it's called Say Dyslexia, the Say Dyslexia bill. I think that's what it is. It seems kind of silly, but people felt like it's important. So essentially what it did is it required schools to screen for dyslexia. That's basically what it required. Now the thing about it is schools typically have screened for dyslexia for the most part, and with this RTI process, that's really kind of one of the things they're geared at anyway. So that came into play. But dyslexia, it's a real thing because I hear questions about dyslexia. Now dyslexia did turn into some weird thing over time because of what you hear on media as far as what dyslexia is and isn't and that sort of thing. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Talked about the schools must screen for. It's not a vision thing. That's often what people think. There's a field in optometry that really feels like it is, and there's some research that tries to support it. But the research, if you look at it, it really doesn't support that dyslexia is a purely visual disorder. It's not the flipping things necessarily. It's a language-based disorder, much more so than the vision thing. So now, letter number flipping, that's a concern. Parents talk about that a lot. It's not abnormal for kids to flip their numbers and letters up to about 3rd grade. It can still happen. So if you've got a 1st grader that's flipping numbers and letters and you have a parent that's really concerned about that, assure them it's probably okay. I mean, could they have a disorder? Yeah, maybe, but it's not uncommon for kids to do that, to flip numbers and letters at that age. And we hear that a lot over in our clinic. And so we have to have a discussion about what's normal, what's not, and how the process goes. I'm going to do it the whole way. So dyslexia is primarily, it's phonological awareness deficit, right? So it's understanding, that's a primary component. So it's understanding like cat, now separated out the sound, so cat, cat. It's these letters represent what we call phonemes, right? They're not syllables, they're phonemes. And so the breakdown is, can kids or individuals, do they have trouble pulling those phonemes apart? Can they put them together? And can they make them smooth to say the word cat? So cat, one syllable, 3 phonemes, 1 word. You can see how it would affect spelling because it's that sound symbol correspondence. Kids with dyslexia, at least the older kids, like the 3rd, 4th grade kids, usually have stronger reading comprehension skills than their basic reading skills. So, they're really slow readers, they're really choppy readers, but what they read, they typically understand a little bit better than their kind of, you listen to them reading. And their listening comprehension skills are typically stronger than their reading skills. So that's kind of the core components. The typical treatment for dyslexia, phonics-based instruction. Go back to what it was, the 70s when we were all phonics-based. Not that that's, because there's the direct instruction versus whole language, and that still goes on today as far as in schools of education as to do we teach reading by direct instruction, which is more phonics-based, or do we teach reading by whole language, which is more immersive, more interest-based? I think most people outside of that recognize now that it's both are important for reading, and so it's an important component. One of the better instructional packages is Wilson Reading. You have to be Wilson certified teacher to do that, but it's really good for phonics-based issues, phonemic awareness issues. Some school systems have those materials and have teachers can do that. Dr. Seuss, I mean, it's one of the best things. I mean, it's phonics. It's that sound symbol correspondence. It plays with words. It plays with the sounds and the letters. It's really good material. And it's fun. So how can you beat it? So what you're trying to do with these kids is you're trying to build their phonics and phonemic awareness, then transition to fluency, because as adults, where it shows up, and over at the university we see it, is fluency. Most individuals with dyslexia can read. It's just that they're very slow readers. And so at the college level, they have a really hard time getting through the material. They understand it, but it's just so slow and laborious for them to get through. Treatment, not vision therapy. I know there are people out in the community that make that recommendation all the time. There's not enough research. I don't want to say there's no research to support it. There's not enough research to support that as a valid treatment. Now, does it work in individual cases? Yeah, maybe, but it's not something that the research holds as, in general, being something that should apply. Behavioral optometry. Yeah. 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 We put about 5 years ago. I had a graduate assistant put him on to go through the literature and pull as much of the intervention research as we could on that, because we're hearing a lot of that coming into the clinic. And so he did, and we got it all summarized, and it's not effective in general. The colored overlays. I don't care. You can, I don't care. So colored overlays is another one that comes into this vision therapy, and that's from the Erlin lenses. I don't know if anyone's heard that name, Erlin. Starts with an I, I believe. Erlin, all the research that supports the colored overlays is done by Erlin, interestingly enough. So there's no corroborating research that supports those as those colored. they take a transparency. It could be a yellow, a red, a different color, and then there's some other. They have ruler things that have sort of transparencies built into them that are different colors that are supposed to help. And maybe it adds a level of interest for the kid. Maybe that would help. But there's no evidence outside of Erlen that it's helpful to actually fix the problem. But it's used. It's out there. And I just do the special diet because that's on everything. It's like ADHD and everything. A diet's going to do it all. It really doesn't. It will help your cardiovascular health and some other things, but it's not going to fix this. Yeah. Things to do at home. So I don't know if this would be helpful if you work with parents, but kids with dyslexia or have those early reading issues where it's kind of breaking down and they're having a hard time. So, read to kids early. Everybody said, but read to kids early with rhyming books. Dr. Seuss is a good example. But there are other books that have rhyming activities involved. Read a lot to the kids. Practice sounding out phonemes. You, the parent, practice sounding out the phonemes to demonstrate to the kid how this works. Again, like the example I used is cat. It's one syllable but has three phonemes, and I got like Sesame Street. You remember the Sesame Street stuff? I don't know. Is it even still on Sesame Street? Okay. So where they sing it, it's like they go through the whole process. That's a great thing, and that's engaging. But again, cat is an example there. But that, which is 4 letters, 1 syllable, and it's got 3 phonemes, right? So it's breaking down to the phonemic components is what's important for kids with dyslexia and those basic reading problems. Flashcards for letters, words, nothing wrong with flashcards. By the way, research pretty solid. Flashcards work. They do. They might be boring at times, but they work. Those of you who've gone through graduate school, flashcards, they work for different things. They work for this too. They're especially important for irregular words. Those are words that don't correspond to this fun phonics, the way phonics works. And then sight words that are just the words they have to memorize. There's like a couple hundred words they need to memorize. Depending on the list, it could be more than that, but around a couple hundred. Another research, evidence-based, simple intervention, listening passage preview. Parent, it could be a teacher, it could be a peer, parent reads from the book while the child follows along, and then the child reads the same passage. And that works. It sounds too simple. It works. And then there's research to support that. And then paired reading. So parent reads a page, give the book to the child reads a page. And that's another really good, simple intervention with research that works. So all of these are evidence-based. Vision therapy? And then I just left this slide up because it's 1:23. So this comes. We always get questions about this, and I just leave the slide in almost every time I do a school-based type of thing. So IDEA 504. The difference in terms of what's what. So IDEA is an equal outcome legislation. So the intent is for the kids to end at the same place, special ed. That's the general intent. It doesn't work that way, but that's the intent. And then 504 is equal opportunity. So you're just leveling the playing field. So if a child has problems focusing, attention, and they have a 504 plan, it's to get them the accommodations to help them have an equal opportunity to learn. It's not to get them to the same end point. IDEA is public, funded, special ed. 504 happens in general ed, not special ed. You have an IEP, an IDEA, which is basically a contract, essentially. It's a contract between really the child and the school, but it's parents and the school agreeing to these services that are going to be provided for this child. In 504, you just get accommodations modifications, which can also be in this, but more specifically talk about that. it's what they have over at university. We typically fall under 504 ADA to get those things. We have LD kids and kids with ADHD, and well, they're young adults. IDEA goes from birth to 22 or end of your secondary school. So a child could graduate if they meet their IEP expectations and goals when they're 18 or 19. Some have significant challenges, and they're there till they're 22, and they age out. And then 504 is birth to death, all the way. So. Yes. Well, I can tell you the reason for that. They're not going to state the reason, but the IDEA, there's a funding stream for those services. And so if they're identified, then there's money to help with that. And 504 is one of those unfunded mandates. And so just from a business standpoint, they want them over here because they're going to get money to help pay for the teachers to provide the services. Otherwise, it's going to be about the same. There'll be more meetings involved if they're an IDEA at special ed, but they're not typically going to get pulled out. They're not going to be set apart, anything like that, for at least for the ADHD kids. I don't know if that, it's money. I think it's similar. I think it's the same. Technically, these kids, if you meet criteria for IDEA, you would meet criteria for 504, but it doesn't work the other way around. So usually this has to be a little bit more severe than what those kids, but it's usually they just kind of scoot them over here and. No, I think there are more disciplinary protections under IDEA than there are under 504. So for some kids that may be helpful, especially with impulsivity and that sort of thing. But that gets into manifestation determinations and all that, and yeah, it's a whole other thing. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but he's yeah. Yeah. Knox County, though it's supposed to be, everything's individualized. We all know that, right? There is a tendency to move that group over into IDA, and it is simply a function of funding. That's all it is.
Okay, so winning us as we have become the pill capital of the country or the world, or whatever we are here. Narcotics, so we see it with commercial services more and more. Children with prenatal narcotic exposure more and whatever it is. So those kids are exposed. Are you seeing particular types of learning disabilities associated with that population? Can you somebody looking at that?
Yeah, I mean, there's research on just about everything going on, but most of those kids have more your ADHD type issues than your kind of your learning issues or general intellectual disability, those cognitive delays versus your specific learning disability.
But how do you know that? I mean, I'm just wondering, how would you know that? I mean, I know they have ADHD problems.
Sure.
Do they also have other specific learning problems?
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to look at the research myself, but there maybe not.
So next time you get a graduate,
Get someone on that. I'll get them on that. Yeah. Well, I know there are plenty out there. Yeah, it's yeah. I know that. Sir.
So in schools under, say, dyslexia, who's assessing dyslexia? What method is it?
Well, they assess it under the general screening. You remember we were talking about the universal screeners, and they assess it through that process. And so typically kids with that would be a dyslexic or dyslexia profile would score significantly lower on the words correct per minute measures. And so by definition, the school is screening for it by going through that process. And that doesn't mean it's the best process, but they're meeting the letter of the law. Not for dyslexia. Yeah. Well, how can I answer this? Yeah. Well, the intervention packages, especially at the younger ages, are primarily phonological based or phonics based, and so the school systems would say that they are addressing that issue because that's the materials that you're using specifically for that. But do they pull those kids out and do a separate evaluation? No. Do they pull those kids out and do a separate intervention? No, not at that point. Now, if they go all the way through the process and they come out the other end and they're identified as learning disorder, then maybe, but not early on. Well, the screening, they have, depending on the system, they have teachers or interventionists trained to do the assessment. I mean, we have some of our graduate students go out and help with some of that screening process in some systems. The school psychologist typically is not involved at that base level. They may be involved in decision making when the data comes in and they start looking at that. But it's usually they have trained a teacher or trained an interventionist to do the screening measures. Which, yeah, and these only take 2 minutes a kid, so it's pretty fast. You're giving them grade level material and timer. You're following along. You read. You time it. Mark words that they miss. See how far they get. Count them up. It's straightforward. What do we do? So, well, for kids, we do your general psychoeducational evaluation, and that includes achievement battery and intelligence and all that sort of stuff. But we do the phonological testing. So we do a comprehensive test of phonological processing, and we've got some other we've got reading tests that we administer and evaluate and look at that. Yeah, we do parts of the WJ. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. And then we give the same recommendations as far as interventions that are more targeted to those problems. So, in the state, MTSU has a Center for Dyslexia, and school systems can send kids down there to have them evaluated for free, but their wait list is like 6 months or longer, and so it's hard to get folks in there, but it's not hard. It's not hard testing. That's the thing. From a school psychologist standpoint, it's not hard testing to do, but you have to be a little bit specific on what you're looking at and how you're evaluating it. So, and then for adults, again, it's more fluency. We're looking at fluency measures and then how they do on phonics components. So.
I'm wondering, so it seems like some of these kids get missed, obviously, with the way the process happens.
Sure.
Especially dealing with insurance, especially here. So they won't pay for achievement testing, education.
That's right. It's not medically necessary.
Then they're also not doing it at the school.
Nope.
So,
yeah. Well, parents can seek it out. That's about the only way that it's going to happen. Sure. We get, the audiology, they send us some referrals because they get kids over there at UT. We send some kids over there that we see no, that's more speech language. And there's a couple of people in town that do dyslexia evaluations specifically, but there's not a lot. So we get referrals from like Sylvan and Huntington and that. So. Sometimes language evaluations, and you probably know, so language evaluations don't necessarily focus on that. Sometimes they focus on more, there's receptive and there's expressive and other components of language than that specific component. If they get a specific referral for that, maybe. The vast majority, and some of you know this, the vast majority of referrals to speech language in the schools are for the speech issues, which are not, they're separate. That's a motor issue, purely a motor issue. All the kids, I think, are screened like at preschool, kindergarten level for speech issues, and so they get shuffled down the chute that they need to go to get their services. Language evaluations are not very frequent unless it's specifically requested. So I'm out of time.
Thank you.